Welcome, dear listener, to a gentle exploration through the culinary world of the medieval era. As you settle into a moment of stillness and calm, feel free to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide this quiet community of curious minds reaches. If unwinding with rich, historical storytelling brings you peace, you're in the right place. Now, close your eyes and imagine a wooden table in a modest medieval home. On it sits a bowl of thin, tasteless porridge, a chunk of rough, dense bread, and, if the household was fortunate, a few scraps of tough, sinewy meat. This was the everyday reality for countless people during the Middle Ages. While royalty and nobility indulged in grand feasts with endless courses, the average person survived on food that was plain, repetitive, and often insufficient. But what made the food of the Middle Ages so dull, so limited for the common folk? To answer this, we must step back in time to a world where just eating enough to get through the day was a constant challenge. In a peasant's cottage, the air did not carry the warm, sweet scent of spices. There was no cinnamon or nutmeg, no pepper or ginger. These exotic ingredients were luxuries, rare treasures, brought from far-off lands by brave merchants who journeyed along perilous trade routes. Imagine the life of those spice traders, risking their safety to transport flavor across continents. Just to understand how precious these goods were, consider that during the 14th century, 1 pound of nutmeg could cost the equivalent of 7 well-fed oxen. For common people, spices like these were out of reach. Instead, they relied on strong, simple flavors: garlic, mustard, and vinegar, ingredients that added a bite to otherwise dull meals. The lack of fresh food didn't help either. Without modern preservation, fruits and vegetables were available only in certain seasons and in small quantities. Those lucky enough to have a small patch of land might grow hardy crops like leeks, onions, or cabbages, but these could never make up for a diet that relied so heavily on grains. Most meals centered around barley, rye, or wheat, made into coarse bread or porridge. Occasionally, peas and beans were added for some variety. This grain-heavy diet filled stomachs, but lacked the essential nutrients needed for growth and health, leading to widespread malnutrition and stunted development. Meat, though treasured, was rare in a peasant's life. A well-off family might raise a pig or keep chickens, perhaps even a cow. But animals were incredibly valuable, not something you slaughtered casually. Meat was usually saved for special events, like weddings, festivals, or when the animal could no longer serve its purpose. And when meat was eaten, nothing was wasted. Every part from organ meats to bones was used. Small animals and birds caught in traps might also appear on the table. Though hunting in noble forests was dangerous and strictly forbidden, the penalty for poaching could be harsh, even deadly. Fish was slightly more accessible, especially for those near rivers or coastlines. But even fish had to be preserved for hard times. Drying, smoking, and salting were the go-to methods. Forget the delicate fillets we enjoy today. Medieval fish was often tough, salty, and heavily cured. Herring, cod, and eel were the most commonly eaten types. Packed into barrels with thick layers of salt, these fish could last for months. Fresh water. Species like carp or pike were highly prized, but only the wealthy could afford to enjoy them. Noble estates often had their own private fish ponds to ensure a steady supply. In such a world of scarcity, medieval cooks had to be inventive with preservation. They pickled, fermented, and dried whatever they could. Cabbage, became sauerkraut. Cucumbers and onions were soaked in vinegar. Fruits were sliced and dried to be eaten later in the cold months. While these preserved items offered some relief from the sameness of daily meals, they were a far cry from the juicy, fresh flavors we take for granted today. Even the basic staples, bread and ale, came with risks. Some dishonest bakers stretched flour by mixing in things like ground acorns, powdered chalk, or even sawdust. This not only reduced the quality of the bread, but made it nearly inedible, rock-hard, bland, and barely nourishing. Ale, too, was often watered down to increase profits, a practice that earned some alewives a nasty reputation. In a time when clean drinking water was scarce, weak ale was often the only safe choice, as the brewing process helped to kill off harmful bacteria. This brings us to perhaps the most unappetizing aspect of medieval dining: the utter lack of hygiene. Without an understanding of germs and food safety, contamination was rampant. Livestock were often kept close to living quarters for warmth and protection, their waste seeping into fearsome areas where food was prepared and consumed. In crowded cities, garbage and human excrement filled the streets, tainting water sources and attracting vermin. It's no wonder that foodborne illnesses were rampant, with even royalty not immune to the perils of spoiled fare. King John of England, for example, is said to have died after overindulging in peaches and new cider, a feast that likely led to a fatal case of dysentery. The spectre of disease was never far from the medieval dinner table. The Black Death, which wiped out a third of Europe's population in the 10th century, spread in part due to the unsanitary conditions that allowed rats and fleas to thrive. Food markets were particularly notorious as breeding grounds for pestilence, with flies buzzing around meat stalls, androdents scurrying underfoot. It's a wonder that anyone survived the perils of medieval dining at all. Yet even in the face of scarcity and disease, there were glimmers of gastronomic hope. Monasteries and abbeys often served as havens of relative plenty, with well-tended gardens and orchards providing a bounty of fresh produce. Monks were known for their culinary skills, with some even penning cookbooks that offered a glimpse into the more refined cuisine of the upper echelons. Of course, this food was not shared freely with the masses, but some monasteries did offer alms to the poor as a form of charity. For the nobility, feasts were an opportunity to showcase their wealth and power. A royal banquet might feature dozens of dishes, from roast swan and peacock to delicate pasties and sweetmeats. Spices flowed freely, as did wine and ale, creating an atmosphere of gluttonous revelry. But even these lavish spreads were not without their dangers. Food poisoning was a common occurrence, with spoiled meats and rancid sauces taking their toll on nobles' stomachs, and the sheer volume of food consumed could lead to painful digestive issues. A reminder that even the privileged were not immune to the hazards of medieval dining. As we reflect on the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, it's hard not to feel a sense of gratitude for the abundance and variety that we enjoy today. Our supermarkets brim with fresh produce from around the globe. Our meats are safe and sanitized, and our spice racks hold flavors that would have been the envy of any medieval monarch. Yet, even as we savor the fruits of modernity, we can't help but marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of our ancestors, who made do with so little and found ways to survive in the face of unrelenting hardship. So, the next time you'd sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate the bounty before you. Savor the flavors and textures that medieval peasants could only dream of and raise. A glass to the countless generations who toiled and struggled to bring us to this point. And if you find yourself grumbling about a less than perfect dish, spare a thought for the Medievaldina, for whom even a simple bowl of porridge was a hard-won blessing. As we let our minds drift back to that distant past, let us take comfort in the knowledge that we are the fortunate inheritors of centuries of culinary, and let us not forget the lessons that history has to teach us. Lessons of perseverance, creativity, and the enduring power of the human spirit to find sustenance and joy even in the darkest of times. And so, dear listener, I bid you good night, and sweet dreams of a world where food is not just a necessity, but a source of endless delight. May your own culinary journey be filled with flavor, nourishment, and the warm glow of gratitude for all that have been given. Until next time, rest well and dream of feasts yet to come. Part 4. Adulterated food and drink in the dimly lit streets of a medieval city. A baker surreptitiously glances left and right before ducking back into his shop. He pulls out a sack of sawdust and begins kneading it into the dough, stretching his paltry supply of flour. For many bakers, this deception was the only way to eke out a meager living. Bread was the lifeblood of the medieval diet, but its purity was often compromised. Unscrupulous bakers would add fillers like ground acorns, chalk, or sawdust to extend their dough. What resulted was a coarse, gritty loaf that offered little nutrition, the very staple that sustained peasants through their back. Labor had become yet another hardship to endure, a unwind to fell victim to the desperation of the times. Alewives and innkeepers, struggling to turn a profit, would water down their brew to stretch it further. The resulting drink was a thincer swill that bore little resemblance to the hearty ale that was the pride of the British Isles. One such alewife, Elizabeth, toils over her bubbling cauldron, stirring in yet another bucket of cloudy water. Her children hover near, their hungry eyes watching each drip, knowing their next meal depends on this batch. As she ladles out a mug off the watered-down brew, she sigh, remembering the rich, full-bodied ale her grandmother once crafted, now lost to necessity. In a time when clean drinking water was a rarity, this adulterated ale and wine became an unfortunate city. Wells and rivers were often contaminated by human and animal waste, making them rife with disease. The alcohol in these drinks, though diluted, was still potent enough to kill some of the harmful bacteria. And so, peasants were forced to choose between risking the sickness of tainted water or the empty calories of watered-down ale. Attempts were made to curb these deceptive practices. The Assay of Bread and Ale, a century law, set strict regulations on the price, weight, and quality of bread and ale. Transgressors faced hefty fines or even time in the pillory. But with limited means of enforcement and the desperation of the poor, these laws did little to stem the tide of food adulteration. And so the medieval peasant's lot was one of constant compromise, a balancing act between the ignoring pain of hunger and the bitter disappointment of adulterated food. Each mouthful was a reminder of their precarious existence, where even the most basic sustenance could not be taken for granted. As we delve further into the realities of medieval food, we must remember that these were not just historical facts, but the daily struggles of real people. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the very spaces in which they lived contributed to the challenges they faced in securing a decent meal. The close quarters shared by man and beast, and the lack of sanitation that plagued medieval cities made the simple act of eating a perilous proposition. Part 5. Unsanitary conditions. Picture, if you will, a small thatched cottage huddled against chill of a medieval winter. Inside, a family huddles around a meager fire, their breath mingling with the steam rising from a bubbling pot of pottage in the corner. A pig roots through the rushes, covering the dirt floor. It snorts and grunts, a constant backdrop to tough families. Daily life? This was the reality for many medieval peasants, a life lived in close quarters with their living. Animals were often kept inside the home for warmth and safety, their dung and debris mingling with the straw and rushes that served as the only floor covering. It was a breeding ground for disease, with fleas and lice thriving in the unsanitary conditions. Even in the grandest castles, sanitation was without a proper understanding of hygiene, even the most lavish feasts could end in tragedy. The story of King John of England serves as a poignant example. And while traveling across the country, the king fell ill after consuming a surfeit of peaches. Historians now believe these peaches were likely spoiled, leading to a case of dysentery that ultimately claimed the king's life. In the crowded cities of medieval Europe, the situation was even more dire. Narrow streets were choked with garbage and human waste, tainting the air and seeping into the water supply. In London, the River Thames served as both a source of drinking water and a dumping ground for the city's refuse. It's little wonder that disease ran rampant with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and even thread-redded Black Death. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 10th century, was in part able to spread so quickly and claim so many lives due to the unsanitary conditions of medieval cities. Fleas, carried by the rats that thrived in the filth, became the unwitting harbingers of the plague, spreading the disease from person to person with terrifying efficiency. For the average peasant, there was little escape from these unsanitary conditions. They lived and died amidst the filth, their bodies weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to disease. Even the simple act of eating, which should have been a source of nourishment and comfort, became a gamble with every. As we consider these realities, it's easy to feel a sense of despair for the plight of the medieval peasant. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of light. The kindness of neighbors sharing what little they had, the solace found in faith and community. In our next chapter, we'll explore how the church, despite its own role in the hardships of the time, also offered a measure of relief and hope to the hungry and the downtrodden. Part 6. The influence of the church. The tolling of church bells marked the rhythm of life in medieval Europe. For peasants toiling in the fields, these peals signaled not just call to prayer, but also a reprieve from the unrelenting demands of their work and their hunger. In a world where so much was uncertain, the church stood as a bastion of stability and authority. But this authority came with its own set of rules and restrictions, many of which centered around food. The Catholic Church mandated frequent fasting and meatless days, particularly during the penitential season of Lent. For days before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy, and eggs, a tall order for those already struggling to put food on the table. The story of one peasant family illustrates the hardship these fasts could impose. John and his wife Margaret toiled from sun-up to sundown on their small plot of land, barely growing enough to feed their 3 children. When Lent arrived, they faced a daunting choice: honor the fast and risk weakening their already malnourished bodies, or defy the church and face the consequences for their immortal souls. In the end, they chose to follow the fast, subsisting on meager portions of bread, pottage, and the occasional dried fish. By Easter, their faces were gaunt and their steps heavy with exhaustion. Yet they took solace in the belief that their suffering would be rewarded in the next life. Despite the additional hardships these fasts imposed, the church was not entirely deaf to the plight of the poor. Monasteries and abbeys often served as a source of food aid, distributing bread and alms to the needy as a form of Christian charity. The monks, with their vast lands and resources, were able to provide a measure of relief to hungry masses. Yet even this charity had its limits. When crops failed and famine struck, the demand for aid often outstripped the church's ability to provide. And for those caught poaching in the royal forests, a desperate tightened to supplement their meager diets with fresh game. The church's mercy was noticeably absent. Poachers, if caught, faced severe punishments from maiming to death, regardless of their circumstances. And so the church's influence on medieval food was a double-edged sword. It provided solace and aid to some while imposing additional burdens. On others, for the peasant family, faith was both a source of strength and a further trial to endure in the face of unrelenting hunger. As we turn our gaze to the final chapter of our journey through medieval food, we'll witness a scene of shocking contrast, the opulent feast of a noble household. Against the backdrop of peasant hardship, these lavish displays serve as a stark reminder of the vast inequalities that defined the era. Part 7, the rare medieval feast. The great hall of the castle is alive with the flicker of a candle's tapestry. The walls, their vibrant threads telling stories of heroic deeds and courtly love. At the head of the room, owner raised ease. The lord and lady preside over a scene of opulence and plenty. Down the center of the hall stretches a massive oak table groaning under the weight of countless dishes. Whole roasted pigs, their skin and golden, jostle for space with elegant silver platters of delicately spiced peacock. Baskets overflow with fresh baked Maine bread, each loaf as white and soft as a cloud. The air is thick with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves. Spices so precious they're worth their weight in gold. In the castle kitchens, the master cook orchestrates a symphony of culinary creation. He barks orders at his underlings, who scurry to baste the meats, stir the pots, and plate the elaborate subtleties, sugar sculptures, crafted dinto, fanciful shapes of castles and unicorns. For the cook, this feast is a chance to showcase his artistry and ingenuity, to solidify his reputation and secure his place in his lord's favor. As the feast progresses, Theatiners gorge themselves on a seemingly endless parade of dishes. They tear into the tender flesh of roast venison, sap on creamy almond soup, and savor the delicate flavor of blanc manger, a dish of shredded chicken mixed with rice, milk, and sugar. They wash it all down with goblets of richly spiced wine and frothy ale. But even amidst this revelry, there are reminders of the precariousness of medieval life. A noblewoman, her face flushed with wine, suddenly pales and excuses herself from the table. Her stomach, churning from the richness of the food, a knight, his teeth rotting from sugary delicacies, bites into a particularly tough piece of meat and winces in pain, and hovering at the edges of their hull. The serving staff watch the excesses of their betters with a mixture of envy and resentment. They know that tomorrow they'll be back to their usual fare, of course, bread and thin GRL. The memory of this feast, a taunting reminder of the gulf between their world and that of their masters. As the last plates are cleared and the final crumbs are swept away, we're left to ponder the stark contrasts of medieval food. For the nobility, feasts were a display of wealth, status, and power, a chance to revel in the finest delicacies the land had to offer. But for the vast majority, food was a daily struggle, a constant battle against scarcity, adulteration, and disease. In our modern world of abundance and choice, it's easy to forget the hardships faced by our medieval ancestors, but by understanding their struggles, we gain a deeper appreciation for the comforts we enjoy today. As we sit down to our own meals, let us take a moment to savor not just the flavors on our tongues, but the hard-won progress that allows us to eat with such ease and variety. And so, as we close the book on this exploration of medieval food, let us do so with a sense of gratitude and perspective. For in the grand tapestry of human history, our own time is but a brief and privileged chapter, woven from the threads of countless lives lived and meals shared, each one a testament to enduring resilience of the human spirit. Conclusion: as we've journeyed through the landscape of medieval food, we've encountered a world of scarcity, hardship, and inequality, from the bland monotony of peasant pottage to the dangerous fillers in adulterated bread. The challenges of feeding oneself in the Middle Ages were unrelenting. We've seen how the lack of variety in spices, the difficulties of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions all conspired to make medieval food a far cry from thecanoucapias we enjoy today. We've witnessed the impact of the Church's fasting edicts, adding spiritual burdens to the already heavy load of the poor. And we've marveled at the opulent feasts of the nobility, a glittering contrast to the grim realities faced by most. But through it all, we've also seen glimmers of humanity's indomitable spirit, the ingenuity of cooks making the most of meager ingredients, the solidarity of communities sharing what little they had, and the solace found in the rituals of faith and feast. In our modern world, it's easy to take for granted the abundance and variety of our food. We can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and cheeses from Europe, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We can dine in restaurants serving cuisines from around the globe, or have a world of flavors delivered to our doorstep. But imagine for a moment transporting a medieval peasant into the aisles of a modern grocery store. The sheer variety would be overwhelming. The vibrant colors of the produce section, the gleaming grey-frogged cases filled with milk and eggs, the shelves upon shelves of prepackaged meals and snacks. It would be like stepping into a fairy tale, a land of unimaginable plenty. And yet, even in our world of culinary riches, we still face our own challenges. We grapple with the environmental impact of our food systems, with issues of excessive inequality, and with the health consequences of overabundance. In our quest for convenience and choice, we sometimes forget the value of simplicity, of seasonal eating and local flavors. Perhaps then there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors. Even as we appreciate how far we've come, we can embrace the joy of sharing a meal with loved ones, the satisfaction of a dish made with care and creativity. We can remember the value of preserving and cherishing the bounty of the earth, rather than taking it for granted. And most of all, we can approach our own meals with a sense of gratitude and wonder, recognizing the incredible journey that food has taken to reach our plates. From the sun-drenched fields, tough bustling kitchens, to the warmth of our own tables, each bite is a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit across the ages. So as we end our journey through the annals of medieval food, let us raise a glass, or perhaps a humble wooden cup to countless generations who came before us through their struggles and triumphs, their hunger and their hopes. They laid the foundation for the world we inhabit today, and in honoring their legacy, we can find the wisdom and perspective to build a future where all may eat with joy, with dignity, and with plenty. As the royal cook bustled about castle kitchens, preparing an extravagant feast, most of his fellow countrymen could only dream of such opulence. For the serf toiling in the fields, a meal was a simple affair of coarse bread and pottage. A thin stew of wait-for vegetals or scraps could be found. On a good day, there might be a bit of salted pork or dried fish to add some flavor to the GRL-like mix. But more often than not, it was a bland and unsatisfying fare that left the belly only half full. The life of a peasant in medieval times was one of unrelenting hardship, and nowhere was this more apparent than in their daily sustenance. While the nobles dined on exotic dishes flavored with costly spices from far-off lands, the common folk subsisted on a diet that was as monotonous as it was meager. But even the privileged were not immune to the perils of medieval food. The lavish feasts that were the hallmark of aristocratic life often came with a hidden cost. With no means of refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant threat, and many a noble fell or even died from consuming contaminated fare. The very X's that were meant to showcase their wealth and status could prove to be their undoing. Such was the fate of King John of England, whose untimely death was attributed to a surfeited of peaches. As the story goes, the king was travelling through the town of King's Lynn when he was seized by a terrible case of dysentery. Some say it was brought on by the rich food he had consumed at a nearby abbey, while others blamed the peaches he had eaten with relish. Whatever the cause, the king's condition quickly worsened and he died a few days later, his reign cut short by a It is a testament to the precariousness of life in the Middle Ages that even the most powerful and privileged were not safe from the dangers that lurked in their food. For the vast majority of people, however, the risks were even greater. In a world where hunger was a constant companion, the temptation to eat spoiled or contaminated food was often too great to resist. This was especially true in times of dearth when crops failed and food was scarce. During these lean years, people would resort to eating whatever they could find, even if it meant risking their health or even their lives. Acorns, grass, and other wild plants were often ground into a coarse flour to make bread, while animals that had dead-off disease were sometimes consumed out of desperation. Even in the best of times, medieval food was often adulterated in ways that would be unthinkable today. Unscrupulous bakers would stretch their dough with fillers like sawdust or chalk, while brewers would water down their ale to increase their profits. Such practices were not only dishonest but also dangerous, as they could lead to serious illness or even death. The alewife who sold her brew in the village tavern was a common figure in medieval life, and one who often bore the brunt of the community's suspicions and resentments. If her ale was weak or sour, she might be accused of adulterating it with noxious substances, even of practicing witchcraft. In a world where superstition held sway, the line between a bad batch of ale and a deadly poison was often blurred. Despite the many challenges and hardships that medieval people faced in their daily lives, they were not without their small joys and comforts. For the peasant family gathered around the hearth at the end of a long day, a simple meal of bread and pottage could be a moment of rest, bite, and togetherness. And for the monks and nuns who dedicated their lives to prayer and service, the austere diet prescribed by their religious order schooled be a source of spiritual nourishment and discipline. But even in the monasteries and abbeys that dotted the medieval landscape, food was not always a source of comfort or sustenance. During the holy season of Lent, when Christians were expected to fast and abstain from meat, the already lit of the religious orders would be further restricted. For long days, They would subsist on little more than bread, water, and the occasional vegetable or fish. For some, this period of deprivation was a welcome opportunity to focus on their spiritual lives and to draw closer to God. But for others, it was a time of great hardship and temptation, as the pangs of hunger gnawed at their resolve and tested their faith. In a world where food was often scarce and unpredictable, the idea of voluntarily giving it up must have seemed like the height of insanity. And yet, despite all the hardships and challenges that medieval people faced in their
daily lives, they found ways to adapt and persevere. They learned to preserve their food through salting, smoking, and drying, to make the most of the meager ingredients available to them, and to find joy and comfort in the simple pleasures of life. In many ways, the story of medieval food is a story of resilience and ingenuity in the face of adversity. It is a reminder of how far we have come in terms of food safety, variety, and abundance, but also of how much we still have in common with our ancestors. For just as they struggled to put food on the table and to nourish their families, so too do we grapple with the challenges of our own time, from climate change and food insecurity to the pressures of modern life, as we sit down to our own meals laden with a dizzying array of flavors and ingredients from all corners of the globe. It is easy to forget the hardships and sacrifices that have brought us to this point, but by understanding the history of our food and the ways in which it has shaped our culture and our identity, we can gain a greater appreciation for the abundance and diversity that we enjoy today. So, the next time you bite into a juicy apple or savor a slice of warm, crusty bread, take a moment to reflect on the long and winding road that has brought us to this point, and give thanks for the countless generations of farmers, cooks, and laborers who have toiled to put food on our tables and who have left us a legacy of resilience, creativity, and hope in the face of even the greatest of challenges. Perhaps if a medieval peasant were to somehow be transported to a modern grocery store, they would be overwhelmed at the sheer abundance and variety of food available. They might marvel at the exotic fruits and vegetables from far-off lands, the gleaming displays of meat and fish, and the aisles upon aisles of packaged and processed foods. But they might also feel a sense of unease or even distrust, wondering at the hidden costs and compromises that have made this abundance possible. They might question the methods by which our food is grown and raised, the additives and preservatives that keep it fresh and appealing, and the impact that our food choices have on our health, our environment, and our communities. In the end, the medieval peasant might simply shake their head in wonder and return to their own time, content with simple fare that has sustained them for generations. For while our modern food system may offer us greater choice and convenience than ever before, it is not without its own challenges and drawbacks. And just as the medieval peasant had to learn to make do with what they had, to find joy and sustenance in the face of scarcity and hardship, so too must we learn to navigate the complexities of our own food landscape. We must learn to make choices that nourish not only our bodies but also our souls, that honor the sacrifices and struggles of those who came before us, and that leave a legacy of health and abundance for generations to come. So let us raise a toast to the humble peasant, the hard-working farmer, the skilled artisan, and all those who have labored to put food on our tables through history. Let us savor the flavors and textures of the foods we eat, not just as a source of sustenance, but as a connection to the past and a promise for the future. And let us never forget the power of food to bring use together, to nourish our bodies and our spirits, and to remind us of our shared humanity in the face of even the greatest of challenges. As we've seen, the medieval spice trade was a lucrative but perilous business. Those who controlled the flow of spices could amass great fortunes, while those who toiled to bring these precious commodities to Europe risked life and limb. One such spice merchant was a man named Giovanni di Marinoli. Born in the early 10th century to a noble Florentine family, Giovanni seemed destined for a life of ease and comfort, but a restless spirit and a thirst for adventure led him down a different path. Giovanni set out on a journey that would take him across the known world, from the bustling ports of Italy to the distant lands of China and India. As a papal envoy and missionary, his official purpose was to spread the Christian faith. But Giovanni was also a keen businessman, always on the lookout for valuable spices and other exotic goods to bring back to Europe. Giovanni's travels were fraught with danger at every turn. He crossed the vast deserts of Central Asia, braving sandstorms and bandits. He navigated treacherous mountain passes in the Himalayas, battling altitude sickness and frostbite. He sailed the storm-tossed seas of the Indian Ocean, praying to survive each monsoon season. But for all the hardships he endured, Giovanni was also enchanted by the wonders he encountered. He marveled at the gleaming white palaces of Konbolik, the Mongol capital later known as Beijing. He admired the pious devotion of the Thomas Christians in southern India. He reveled in the heady scents and flavors of the spice markets in Sun and Malabar. Along the way, Giovanni gathered a rich cargo of cinnamon, pepper, cloves, and nutmeg, carefully packed in chests to protect them from moisture on the long journey home. He knew that if could bring these spices safely back to Italy, he stood to make a fortune. But Giovanni's luck was not to hold. According to some accounts, his ship was lost at sea on the return voyage, taking him and his precious spices down to Thebrany Deep. Other tales hold that he survived the journey, only to be robbed and murdered by brigands on the outskirts of Florence, his spices scattered to the wind. Whatever the truth of his fate, Giovanni di Marinoli's story reminds us of the incredible risks and rewards of the medieval spice trade. For a few wealthy merchants and lucky adventurers, spices could be a ticket to untold riches. But for most, like Giovanni, they remained a tantalizing dream, always just out of reach. As we drift off to sleep, let us imagine we are in a bustling spice market in some far-flung corner of the medieval world. The air is thick with the scent of pepper and cinnamon, cardamom and saffron. Merchants haggle in a dozen different tongues, their voices rising and falling like the tide. We wander the narrow lanes, baskets in hand, marveling at the colourful mounds of spices from every corner of the globe. Here, a pile of ginger root, gnarled and pungent. There, a heap of cloves. Like tiny brown nails, their aroma warm and sweet. But as we fill our baskets, we can't help but feel a pang of regret for the many who will never taste these flavours. For the poor peasants back home, a pinch of pepper would be an unthinkable luxury, let alone a fragrant curry or a spiced wine. Their food, as we'll explore further, is a monotonous grind of growing grit, a far cry from the sumptuous feasts we've seen at the tables of the wealthy. But even those lavish banquets, as we'll soon discover, could come with their own hidden dangers and disgusting surprises. So, let us savour this imagined abundance, this rare sensory delight as we drift deeper into dreams, for when we wake, we'll have to confront once more the harsh realities of food in the Middle Ages, realities that made filling one's belly a daily battle for princes and paupers alike. The scarcity and hardship that defined medieval food for Themuses extended even to the staples that formed the backbone of their diets. Bread, the most basic and universal of foods, was often a coarse, unappetizing loaf that would be nearly unrecognizable today. For poorer peasants, bread was made from lower quality grains like barley, rye, and even beans or chestnuts in times of shortage. This resulted in dense, dark loaves that were difficult to digest and provided little nutrition. The bread was often full of gritty impurities from poor milling techniques, and it would quickly go stale or mouldy in the damp conditions of many peasant homes. Even for slightly better off peasants who could afford wheat bread, the end product was a far cry from the fluffy leavened loaves we enjoy today. Leaven-weaning agents like yeast were expensive and hard to come by, so most bread was unleavened flatbread, similar to modern par. These flatbreads will be baked on a hearthstone or dried in the sun, resulting in a hard cracker-like consistency. The quality of bread was so important that it was often used as a marker of social class. The whitest, finest loaves made from pure wheat flour were reserved for the nobility, while the greyish-brown loaves of the peasantry were derided as black bread. In some regions, strict laws even prohibited commoners from consuming white bread, reserving it as a privilege of the elite. One figure who stood out in the history of medieval bread production was the 10th century mystic Saint Hildegard of Bingen. Born into a noble family in what is now Germany, Hildegard entered the monastic life as a young girl and Rosetto became the abbess of her own community. In addition to her visionary spiritual writings and musical compositions, Hildegard was renowned for her knowledge of herbalism and natural medicine. She wrote extensively about the properties of grains and the importance of proper nutrition, even at a time when such ideas were not widely understood. In her treatise Physica, Hildegard described spelt ancient grain closely related to wheat as the best grain for human consumption.
She believed that spelt bread nourished the body and enhanced longevity while cautioning against the consumption of raw cereals as damaging to health. Hildegard put her knowledge into practice, overseeing the extensive agricultural lands and bakery of Horreby. Under her guidance, the nuns of Bingen produced high-quality, spelt bread that was distributed to the sick and to poor in the surrounding community. Though spelt was still a luxury commodity out of reach for most peasants, Hildegard's advocacy of it, a healthier alternative to common wheat, was remarkably Modern nutritional science has vindicated many of her claims, showing spelt to be higher in protein and easier to digest for many people than highly processed modern wheat. The life and work of Hildegard of Bingen provides a glimpse into the crucial role that bread played in medieval society, not just as a staple food, but as a symbol of social status and a potential tool for healing. Her teachings informed a holistic understanding of the connection between food and health, foreshadowed modern ideas about nutrition and wellness. Despite the efforts of visionaries like Hildegard, bread for most people in the Middle Ages remained a coarse, bland staple that was often scarce. The unequal distribution of this basic necessity was just one more way in which the stark class divides of medieval society manifested in its food culture. For the poorest peasants, even the meager comfort of a regular supply of bread could be stripped away by the cruel twists of fate and weather. In times of drought, flood, or blight, when grain crops failed, the spectre of famine loomed large over communities. During these dreaded years of death, food prices would skyrocket while wages plummeted, leaving many peasants unable to afford even a basic subsistence. With no social safety net to rely on, the poorest were left to starve or resort to desperate measures like eating bark, grass, or even cannibalism. In the most extreme cases, one of the worst famines to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine of a catastrophic confluence of factors, including climate change, crop failures, and the economic fallout of endless wars, plunged the continent into a year period of starvation and misery. Chronicles of the time paint a grim picture of the suffering endured by the common people. Men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, wrote the Flemish monk William of Nangus. Some men, it was said, compelled by hunger, ate the bodies of executed criminals, and some poor people even ate their own children. The famine hit the Low Countries in Scandinavia particularly hard, with mortality rates as high as 2% in some regions. In the German city of Erfurt, the famine years saw an average of deaths per day compared to just 2 per day in normal times. Even in the best of times, the threat of hunger was never far away for medieval peasants. Their precarious existence, always at the mercy of the elements and the whims of their lords, meant that food insecurity was a constant companion. The grim reality of famine cast a long shadow over the medieval world, serving as a reminder of the fragility of life in an era before modern agriculture and social welfare. It was a world where even the most basic necessity of bread could not be taken for granted, and where the spectre of starvation lurked just one bad harvest away. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we'll see how this pervasive scarcity and insecurity shaped not just the diets, but the entire worldview of medieval people. In a time when a full belly was a luxury and a stale crust a treasure, Food took on a significance that is hard to imagine from our modern vantage point of abundance and choice. But first, let's turn our attention to another staple of the medieval diet that was scarcely more appetizing than the heiress bread, meat, for all but the wealthiest nobles. Meat was a rare treat reserved for special occasions, and when it did appear on the menu, it often came in forms that would turn the stomachs of modern diners. In the absence of refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on a variety of preservation methods to keep meat from spoiling. Salting was the most common technique, with heavily salted meats being a staple of winter diets. But the salt itself was often of poor quality, full of impurities that could make the meat taste bad or even cause illness. Smoking and drying were also used to preserve meats, particularly in the form of sausages and hams. These could keep for longer periods, but would become hard and unappetizing over time, with a texture more akin to leather than to the juicy, tender meats we enjoy today. For most peasants, meat usually meant tough, stringy cuts from older animals that were no longer useful for milk or labor. Beef was rarely eaten by commoners, as cattle were simply too valuable to slaughter. Pork and poultry were somewhat more common, but were still luxury items for most. The type and amount of meat in medieval diets varied significantly by region and social status. In Slavic regions and parts of Scandinavia, people largely relied on fresh water, fish rather than terrestrial meat. Hunting was a cherished privilege of the nobility, who jealously guarded their exclusive rights to venison and other game. Meats. One vivid glimpse into the inequality of medieval meat consumption comes from the records of King Richard II's cooks in the late th century. For a single royal feast in the kitchens prepared chickens, sheep, stags, and little pigs, fare fit for a king indeed. In contrast, a peasant family might expect to eat meat only a handful of times per year, usually on major religious holidays like Christmas and Easter. Even then, the cuts would be meager and have been scrupulously saved for months. But for one brief moment in the history of medieval England, the humble peasantry got a taste of the bounteously reserved for their betters. In the aftermath of the Black Death, which killed up to half the population in the th century, the massive labor shortage gave surviving peasants newfound bargaining power. With fewer mouths to feed and a surplus of land, many peasants found themselves in the novel position of being able to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For a few short decades, the standard of living for English commoners actually improved markedly. Meat consumption rose as more peasants could afford to keep livestock for their own tables rather than for the markets. Wages doubled or even tripled in some regions, allowing laboring families to supplement their usual fare of porridge and bread with the occasional chicken, pig, or even cow. But this golden age for the peasantry was too short-lived. The landed nobility, alarmed at the rising power of the lower classes, fought back with lows attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and tie peasants to the land. The tensions between the emboldened peasantry and the reactionary aristocracy would erupt in the Peasants' Revolt, although the revolt was brutally suppressed with its leaders executed and its gains largely rolled back. It stands as a testament to the transformative impact of the Black Death on medieval society. For a brief, shining moment, the common people of England got a taste of a life less constrained by scarcity and toil. But for most of the Middle Ages, and for most people, meat remained a rare and coveted treat. Its scarcity made it a patent symbol of status and wealth, a tangible reminder of the chasm between the haves and have-nots. In the grathals of castles and manors, Nobles and knights feasted on heaping platters of roasted game and delicate fowl, washing it down with fine wines and honeyed me. But in the hovels of the peasantry, a scrap of salted pork or a stringy chicken leg was a hard-won delicacy. Tobe savoured and stretched as far as it could go. This disparity in access to such a basic foodstuff underscores the harsh inequalities that defined life in the Middle Ages. In a world where even a full belly was a mark of privilege, the gulf between rich and poor was as hideous. The distance between a king's banquet table and a peasant's empty trencher, as we've seen. The rare morsel of meat was a highlight in the otherwise dreary and monotonous diet of most medieval people. But even this small pleasure was subject to strict regulation by the power of the Church. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church wielded immense influence over every aspect of daily life, and food was no exception. The church calendar was dotted with fast days and meatless days when the consumption of animal products was strictly forbidden. The most significant of these was the season of Lent, the day period leading up to Easter. During this time, all meat, dairy, and eggs were off limits, leaving the faithful to subsist on a meager diet of fish, vegetables, and bread. For wealthy nobles, this was a minor inconvenience. They could afford to import exotic fruits, nuts, and spesesto liven up their Lenten fare, and their well-stocked fish ponds ensured a steady supply of fresh seafood. But for Theppa, Lent meant an even more restricted and monotonous diet than usual. The Church's rationale for these dietary restrictions was rooted in the idea of penance and spiritual discipline. By denying themselves the pleasures of theft, even in the form of food, the faithful were thought to be purifying their souls and aligning themselves with suffering of Christ. But in a world where hunger and scarcity were daily realities for most people, the idea of voluntary deprivation must have seemed a bitter irony. For peasants who rarely tasted meat anyway, the imposition of additional restrictions could feel like a cruel joke. Yet the power of the Church was so great that few dared to openly flout its dietary decrees. To do so was to risk not just social ostracism, but the very real threat of eternal damnation. In a time when the afterlife was considered more real and important than earthly existence, this was a potent deterrent indeed. One poignant tale that illustrates the hardships of Lenten fasting comes from the records of a 8th century English manor. In a peasant woman named Agnes Paston was brought before the Menorah court on charges of stealing 2 loaves of bread during Lent. In her defense, Agnes pleaded that she had stolen the bread to feed her starving children who were too young to understand the rules of the fast. She begged for mercy, arguing thatchily God would not want her innocent babes to go hungry. The court, moved by her plea, took the unusual step of acquitting Agnes of the theft charge. But they still admonished her for breaking the Lenten fast, reminding her that the needs of the soul must take precedence over the desires of the body. For Agnes and countless others like her, the rigid dietary restrictions of the Church must have seemed like just one more burden in a life already defined by hardship and hunger. In a world where food was scarce and survival precarious, the idea of willingly foregoing what little sustenance was available must have been difficult to swallow. But that Church's influence on medieval food culture wasn't entirely negative. Monasteries and abbeys were often at the forefront of agricultural innovation, pioneering new techniques for crop rotation, irrigation, and selective breeding. They also served as repositories of classical knowledge about agriculture and food preservation, keeping alive the wisdom of ancient Rome and Greece. Moreover, the Church played a vital role in providing food aid to the poor and hungry. Monasteries were known for their charitable distribution of bread and ale to the needy, and many operated hospitals and almshouses to care for the sick and destitute. In a time before social welfare programs or organized charity, the church was often the only safety net available to the most vulnerable members of society. Its teachings about the virtues of charity and the sin of gluttony helped to create a moral imperative for those with means to share their bounty with the less fortunate. Of course, this charity was often mixed with a hefty dose of paternalism and moral judgment. The poor were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps they were given and to accept their lot in life as divinely ordained. But for those on the brink of starvation, even a small act of kindness could mean the difference between life and death. As the Middle Ages wore on, the culinary distance between the wealthy and the poor only grew wider. By Thelete, and centuries, Europe was in the grips of what some historians have called the Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures and frequent climatic disruptions. Crop yields declined as fields were battered by droughts, floods, and unseasonable frosts. Food prices skyrocketed, leaving many commoners unable to afford even basic staples. At the same time, the Black Death and subsequent waves of plague had decimated the population, leading to labor shortages and rising wages. In response, the nobility and emerging merchant class doubled down on conspicuous consumption as a way to display their wealth and status. Lavish banquets featuring exotic dishes and opulent displays of sugar sculptures and gilded peacocks became the order of the day. Meanwhile, the poor were left to survive on whatever meager scraps they could scourge. In times of death, many were reduced to eating famine bread made from a desperate mix of peas, beans, acorns, and even sawdust. Others resorted to foraging for wild plants or hunting any animals they could catch, from rodents to crows. But even in the midst of this stark inequality, there were glimmers of hope and resistance. Peasant revolts like the English Rising of Ore, the German Bonnu movement of the early century, saw the common people rising up to demand better treatment and a fairer share of the wealth. While these uprisings were often brutally suppressed, they nonetheless testified to the unquenchable human spirit and the enduring dream of a world where everyone could enjoy the basic dignity of a full belly and a decent life. And in the kitchens and gardens of ordinary people, the seeds of a more vibrant and diverse food culture were being planted. Women who bore the primary responsibility for feeding their families were the unsung heroes of medieval cuisine. With creativity and resourcefulness, they found ways to coax flavor and nourishment out of even the humblest ingredients. In the folk traditions of pickling, preserving, and foraging, they passed down knowledge that would sustain their communities through the lean times and lay the foundation for the culinary revolutions to come. And in the communal ovens and shared meals of village life, they nurtured a spirit of solidarity and resilience that would prove as sustaining as any loaf of bread. So, while the story of food in the Middle Ages is undoubtedly one of hardship and deprivation, it is also a story of ingenuity, resilience, and hope. In the face of scarcity and oppression, medieval people found ways to nourish not just their bodies, but their spirits, to find joy and communion in the simple act of sharing a meal. As we look back on this distant and often difficult past, we can take inspiration from their example. In a world that is still riven by inequality and hunger, their story reminds us of the fundamental human right to food and the vital importance of fighting for a more just and sustainable food system. And in our own kitchens and around our own tables, we can honor their legacy by cherishing the abundance we enjoy, and remembering always to share it with those who have less. For, in the end, the true measure of a society is not in the opulence of its feasts, but as we've seen, for the vast majority of people in medieval Europe, food was a daily struggle of scarcity, monotony, and even danger. But there was one place where the food was always abundant, always varied, and always exquisite. The royal court. While peasants subsisted on GRL and stale bread, nobles feasted on the finest delicacies the land had to offer. Imagine being the royal cook, entrusted with the monumental task of preparing lavish meals for the king and his court. Your day begins before dawn as you oversee the delivery of ingredients from far and wide. Wagons rolled into the castle courtyard laden with barrels of wine from Burgundy, wheels of cheese from the Alps, crates of spices from the Orient. The king's huntsmen rode in with deer and boar slung over their saddles, ready to be transformed into savory roasts and pies. In the cavernous castle kitchens, a small army of servants bustled about under your command. Fires roared in the great hearths as spits turned slowly, roasting meats to perfection. Cauldrons bubbled with fragrant stews and soups, while bakers kneaded dough for bread and pastries. The air was thick with the aroma of exotic spices. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, each worth more than their weight in silver. As the hour of the feast approached, you put the finishing touches on your creations. A magnificent roast swan, its plumed neck curving gracefully on the platter. A gleaming gaspic, studded with gems of fruit and topped with gold leaf. A towering subtlety in the shape of the king's coat-of arms, painted in vibrant hues. Each dish was a work of art crafted to delight the eye as much as the palate. When at last the noble guests filed into the great hall and took their seats, it was time for your masterpieces to be unveiled. Servants paraded the platters in, presenting each to the high table with a flourish. The guests ood and ad asti were served, marveling at the bounty before them. For a few glorious hours they dined like gods, sampling delicacies from every corner of the known world. But even here, in the rarefied realm of the royal court, the spectre of illness lurked behind the splendor. For all their expense and artistry, even the most sumptuous disescaled harbor deadly spoilage, and the sheer excess of the feast often led to overindulgence, as nobles gorged themselves far past the point of satisfaction. It was not unheard of for a courtier to literally eat himself to death, felled by his own gluttony. So while the royal feast may have stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the common folk, it was not without its own perils. In a world without refrigeration or food safety standards, no one was truly safe from the dangasef, the dining table. Rich or poor, the medieval relationship with food was always a precarious one. Today, we can scarcely imagine the hardships that our ancestors endured simply to fill their bellies. The poorest among us have access to a variety and quality of food that would have been unthinkable even for medieval kings. We can walk into a gleaming supermarket and find fruits and vegetables from every season, meats and cheeses from every continent, spices and sauces from every cuisine. We can eat what we want when we want, without fear of famine or food poisoning. But perhaps in our abundance, we have lost something as well. The medieval peasant, for all his suffering, likely felt a deep connection to the land and the turning of the seasons. He knew intimately these wheat and toil that went into every mouthful. While we may pity him his limited options, he would likely look upon our prepackaged, mass-produced meals with a mixture of wonder and horror. One can imagine a medieval serf transported to the snack aisle of a modern grocery store, marveling at the colorful bags and boxes stretching out before him. He picks up a shiny packet, turning it over in his weathered hands. Cheetos. He reads slowly, sounding out the unfamiliar word, made with real cheese. He shakes his head in disbelief. Real cheese. For a mere peasant, impossible. He puts it back on the shelf and moves on, overwhelmed by the strange bounty of this new world. As we drift off to sleep, bellies full of whatever we desire, let us take a moment to reflect on the privilege of choice. Let us remember the countless generations who came before, who fought and scraped and starved so that we might have the luxury of a full ladder, and let us be grateful for the simple everyday miracle of enough to eat. As the sun set over the bustling port city of Venice, a weary spice merchant named Luca disembarked from his ship. His precious cargo of exotic spices from the east secured tightly in his satchel. Luca had spent months traversing the treacherous Silk Road, braving bandits, sandstorms, and searing heat to bring a taste of faraway lands to the tables of wealthy Europeans. For Luca and merchants like him, the spice trade was a lucrative but perilous endeavor. The demand for spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and saffron was insatiable among the nobility, who used them to flavor their rich dishes and show off their affluence. But for the common folk, these fragrant seasonings remained an unattainable luxury, their meals remaining sadly bland and unappetizing. As Luca navigated the winding canals of Venice to deliver his wares to his wealthy clientele, he couldn't help but reflect on the stark divide between the opulent feasts of Theric and the meager rations of the poor. While nobles dined on succulent roasts flavored with exotic spices, peasants subsisted on little more than coarse bread and watery porridge, their palates never knowing the lively tang of pepper or the warm, sweet embrace of cinnamon. The life of a spice merchant was one of constant movement and danger, with fortunes won and lost on the whims of the sea and the shifting sands of the desert. Luca had seen his fair share of hardships on his journeys: attacks by marauding bandits, treacherous mountain passes, and the ever-present threat of disease. But he pressed on, driven by the promise of riches and the thrill of the unknown. As he made his final delivery and counted his profits, Luca couldn't shake the feeling that for all the wealth and prestige the spice trade brought him, it remained a bitter reminder of the deep inequalities that plagued medieval society. While he dinnied in saffron-infused stews and fragrant spiced wines, the common people went to bed with growling stomachs, their dreams haunted by the enticing aromas that wafted from the kitchens of the elite. With a heavy heart, Luca retired to his lavish villa for the night, knowing that tomorrow he would once again set sail for distant lands, chasing the promise of fortune and leaving behind a world where the simple pleasure of a flavorful meal remained an unattainable dream for most. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a weary housewife named Matilda stirred from her slumber, her mind already racing with the countless tasks that lay ahead. For Matilda and countless other women across medieval Europe, the arrival of autumn heralded not a season of bountiful harvests and joyous feasts, but rather a time of ceaseless labor and knowing anxiety about the looming spectre of winter. With the days growing shorter and the nights turning colder, Matilda knew that she had precious little to preserve what meager crops her family had managed to coax from the unyielding earth. Every scrap of food was precious, and nothing could be allowed to go to waste, lest they face the unthinkable prospect of starvation in the bleak months ahead. As she set about her work, Matilda's mind wandered to the lavish feasts of the nobility, where sumptuous meats and exotic delicacies were consumed with want and abandon. For her and her fellow peasants, such extravagances were little more than cruel jests, taunting reminders of the vast chasm that separated the haves from the have-nots in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. With calloused hands and an aching back, Matilda toiled from dawn until dusk, salting and smoking what little Mithy had managed to raise, pickling vegetables in precious vinegar and hanging herbs to dry in the rafters. Thew work was monotonous and exhausting, but she couldn't afford to rest, knowing that every morsel she preserved now could mean the difference between life and death come winter. As the days wore on and the leaves began to turn, Matilda's thoughts turned to the harsh realities that lay ahead. Even with all her hard work, she knew that the winter would be a time of scarcity and hardship, with meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin girl. Day after day, the spectre of hunger was a constant companion, lurking just beyond the threshold, waiting to sink its icy claws into the vulnerable and the weak. But even in the face of such bleak prospects, Matilda found solace in the knowledge that her tireless efforts would at least give her family a fighting chance. With a fierce determination burning in her heart, she continued her labors, her hands raw and her spirit weary, but her resolve unshakable. For in a world where famine and privation were constant threats, the simple act of preserving food was an act of defiance, a stubborn refusal to submit to the unyielding cruelty of fate. As the first snowflakes began to fall and the chill winds of winter swept across the land, Matilda could only pray that her labors had been enough. With a heavy heart and an empty lowered, she prepared to face the long, dark months ahead, knowing that for her and countless others like her, the struggle for survival was only just beginning. In a grand castle nestled amidst rolling hills and verdant forests, a lavish feast was underway, the great hall filled with the raucous laughter and clinking of goblets as nobles from far and wide gathered to partake in an extravagant display of wealth and power. At the head of the table sat the lord of the manor, his bejeweled fingers tearing into a succulent roast swan, its delicate flesh flavored with exotic spices from distant lands. All around him the tables groaned under the weight of countless delicacies, savory meat pies, rich stews, and decadent pastries, each one a testament to the skill of the castle's master chefs. The air was thick with the aroma of roasting meats and the heavy scent of mulled wine, a sensory feast that stood in stark contrast to the meager rations of the serfs toiling in the fields beyond the castle walls. For these lowly peasants, the very notion of such a feast was little more than a cruel fantasy, a tantalizing glimpse of a world forever beyond their reach. As they huddled in their drafty HVLs, their bellies gnawing with hunger, they could only dream of the rich flavors and sumptuous textures that graced the tables of their betters. Their own meals, if they could even be called that, consisted of little more than a thin girl made from whatever scraps and leftovers they could A few lucky ones might have a meager crust of bread to gnaw on, but for most, even that was a rare luxury. The thought of meat, let alone the succulent delicacies being devoured by the nobles, was little more than a distant fantasy. As the feast wore on and the wine flowed freely, the nobles grew ever more boisterous, their laughter ringing through the halls and echoing off the stone walls. They traded bawdy jokes and tales of their exploits, their face flushed with the warmth of the fire and the satisfaction of their overindulged appetites. But beyond the castle walls, the serfs huddled in their misery, their stomachs cramping with hunger, and their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they would likely never know the pleasures of a full belly or a contented smile. For them, life was little more than an endless cycle of back-breaking labor and knowing hunger, the cruel whims of fate forever conspiring to keep them in their place. As the last embers of the feast's great fires died out, and the nobles retired to their plush chambers, their serfs returned to their own meager dwellings, their minds haunted by the tantalizing aromamus and raucous laughter that had filled the night air. With heavy hearts and empty stomachs, they settled in for another long, cold night, the spectre of hunger, their constant companion, and the dream of a better life little more than a cruel, taunting mirage. In the bustling streets of a medieval town, an aloof wife named Agnes hurried to and fro, her arms laden with jugs of her latest brew. Agnes was a stout, nonsense woman who had been brewing ale for as long as anyone could remember. It was a hard life, fraught with long hours and meager profits, but it was the only life she had ever known that, as she made her way through the winding alleys, dodging the refuse and filth that littered the streets, Agnes couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt over the shortcut she had taken with her latest batch. Times were tough, and the price of grain had skyrocketed, leaving her with little choice but to stretch her ale with a bit of extra water. It was a risky move, one that could land her in hot water with the local authorities if anyone found out, but what choice did she have? Agnes knew that her customers, mostly hard-working labourers and craftsmen, relied on Hurrell to provide a brief respite from the drudgery of their daily lives. They craved the rich, hearty flavour and the pleasant buzz that came with a few pints after a long day's work, but with the cost of ingredients eating into her already meagre profits, Agnes had been forced to cut corners wherever she could, as she arrived at the tavern and began to unload her wares. Agnes couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she was betraying her customers' trust. She took pride in her craft, and the thought of serving them watered-down swill made her stomach churn. But what choice did she have? It was either adulterate her brew, or risk losing everything she had worked so hard to build. With a heavy heart, Agnes began to serve her customers, watching as they eagerly quaffed down the subpar ale, their faces contorting in disappointment as they realized that something was amiss. Some grumbled under their breath, while others outright complained, demanding to know what had happened to the usually stellar brew. Agnes did her best to deflect their questions and assuage their concerns, but the guilt continued to gnaw at her. She knew that her actions were wrong, but in a world where survival was a daily struggle, sometimes compromises had to be made. As the night wore on and the crowd began to thin, Agnes finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She surveyed the empty jugs and the meager pile of coins on the counter, a bitter reminder of the harsh realities of her trade. With a weary sigh, she began to clean up, her mind already racing with worries about how she would make ends meet in the days to come. For Agnes and countless other alewives like her, their struggle to survive in a world of scarcity and hardship was a constant battle. Each day brought new challenges and difficult choices, and the line between right and wrong often blurred in the face of desperation. But still they persevered, driven by the hope that someday, somehow their hard work and sacrifice would pay off and they would finally know the taste of a better life. In the grand halls of a medieval palace, a royal cook named Gome scurried about the kitchen, his brow furrowed in concentration as he oversaw the preparations for the evening's lavish feast. Gome was a master of his craft, renowned throughout the land for his ability to create culinary masterpieces that dazzled the senses and left even the most discerning palates in awe. As he moved from station to station, barking orders and sampling sources, Gome couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at the opulence and extravagance that surrounded him. The kitchen was a hive of activity, with scully maids and kitchen boys scurrying to and fro, their arms laden with the finest ingredients from across the realm. There were plump capons and succulent roasts, their skins glistening with honey and spices, mountains of fresh fruits and vegetables, their colors so vibrant they seemed to leap off the platters, and delicate pastries and confections, each own a work of art in its own right. It was a true testament to the wealth and power of the royal court, and Gome revelled in his role as the mastermind behind it all. But even as he basked in the glory of his creations, Gome couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at the back of his mind. He knew all too well the stark contrast between the lavish feasts he prepared for the nobility and the meagre scraps that passed for meals among the common folk. It was a divide that troubled him deeply, though he knew that to speak out against it would be to risk everything he had worked so hard to achieve. As the final preparations were made and the first course was served, Gome watched from the shadows as the nobles took their seats, their faces alight with anticipation. He saw the way their eyes widened in delight as they tasted his creations, the appreciative murmurs and nods of approval that rippled through the crowd. For a moment he allowed himself to bask in the satisfaction of a job well done. But as the night wore on and the revelry grew more boisterous, Gome couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that tugged at his heart. He thought of the countless hungry mouths behind the palace walls, the gaunt faces and hollow eyes of those who had never known the pleasure of a full belly. As last of the dishes were cleared away, and the nobles retired to their chambers, their stomachs groaning with excesses of the feast, Gome finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He slumped against the kitchen wall, his eyes closed and his heart heavy with the weight of the injustices he had witnessed. In that moment, he couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to live in a world where food was not a privilege reserved for the few, but a basic right afforded to all. He knew that such a world was little more than a dream, a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars themselves, but still, he couldn't help but hope that someday, somehow, things might change, and the plenty he created in Thepele's kitchens might find its way to those who needed it most. Until then, Gome knew that he would continue to plight his trade, his hands forever stained with the guilt of the plenty he created and the poverty he helped perpetuate. It was a burden he would carry with him always, a constant reminder of the cruelty and inequality that lay at the heart of the medieval world. As we have journeyed through the annals of medieval history, exploring the harsh realities and cruel inequities that define the era's food culture, it is impossible not to feel a sense of gratitude for the relative abundance and variety that we enjoy in the modern age. The struggles and hardships faced by our ancestors, from the lowliest serf to the most skilled artisan, serve as a poignant reminder of just how far we have come in our quest to ensure that all people have access to the basic necessities of life. But even as we celebrate the progress we have made, it is important to remember that the spectre of hunger and malnutrition still looms large in many parts of the world. Even in the midst of plenty, there are still those who go toed with empty stomachs and aching hearts, their dreams haunted by the same cruel inequalities that plagued the medieval world. As we reflect on the lessons of the past and the challenges of the present, it is clear that the fight for food justice is one that is far from over. It is a struggle that will require the collective efforts of all those who believe in the basic human right to nourishment and sustenance, a struggle that will test our resolve and our compassion in equal measure. But even in the face of such daunting odds, we must never lose sight of the progress we have made and the hope that sustains us. We must draw strength from the courage and resilience of those who came before us, those who toiled in the fields and labored in the kitchens, their hands calloused and their hearts heavy with the weight of their burdens. And we must continue to push forward, to fight for a world in which no one goes hungry and which the bounty of the earth is shared equally among all those who call it home. It is a vision that may seem distant and unattainable, a dream as fragile and fleeting as the wisps of steam rising from a bowl of GRL, but it is a dream worth fighting for, a dream that has the power to transform the world and bring hope to the hearts of all those who hunger for a better tomorrow. So let us go forth with renewed purpose and determination, armed with the knowledge of the past and the hope of the future. Let us work to build a world in which the plenty of Thepala's kitchens finds its way to the bellies of the poor, and in which the joys of the harvest are shared by altos who have labored to bring it to fruition. For in the end, the struggle for food justice is not just about filling stomachs and sating hunger. It is about the very essence of what it means to be human, about the bonds of compassion and empathy that bind us all together across the gulfs of time and space. It is a struggle that will require all of our strength and all O4 courage. But it is a struggle that we cannot afford to lose. So let us go forth with open hearts and willing hands, ready to do our part in the great work of building a world in which all people can know the simple joy of a full belly and a contented smile. For in that world, the legacy of the medieval food culture will not be one of scarcity and deprivation, but one of
abundance and hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of times. Of course, for the peasants toiling in the fields from dawn to dusk, such extravagance was unimaginable. They subsisted on the moss meagre of meals, their bellies never fully sated. A typical repast might consist of a thin barley or rye porridge known as pottage accompanied by a hunk of dense coarse bread. If they were fortunate, they might have a small scrap of hard cheese or a few shriveled peas to add some sustenance. Meat was a rare luxury, perhaps a bit of tough, stringy salted pork on a special occasion like Christmas or Easter. The lack of variety in the peasant diet was striking. While the nobility dined on delicacies from distant lands, the common folk made do with the same bland staples day after day. There was little to break the monotony save for the changing of the seasons, which dictated what meagre produce might be available. In the spring, tender greens like nettles or dandelions might provide a welcome respite from the usual fare. Come summer, a few precious fruits, small hard apples or bitter crab apples, could be gathered from the woods. Autumn brought the harvest, season the time of back-breaking labor, but also a brief abundance of fresh grains and perhaps a slaughtered hog or two to put up salt meat. For the long winter ahead, winter, the leanest and most dreaded of seasons for the medieval peasant. As the days grew short and the nights bitter cold, families huddled around smoky hearths, bellies pinched with hunger. What little food remained from the harvest had to be carefully hoarded, doled out in small portions to make it last until spring. This was the time of year when the pottage grew thinner and more watery, the bread even harder and more a tooth-breaking. Starvation was a constant spectre, waiting to claim the weak and vulnerable. It's hard for us to imagine such a precarious existence, where a single failed crop could spell doom for an entire village. Yet for most people in the Middle Ages, this was the grim reality of daily life. They lived at the mercy of the elements, the nobility, and often cruel whims of fate. A mouth to feed was a burden as much as a blessing. Another empty belly to fill from limited resources, even those slightly higher up the social ladder. Like skilled craftsmen or prosperous freemen, rarely enjoyed much better fare than their poorer neighbours. A bowl of pottage might be enriched with a bit of precious butter or a scrap of meat, but the fundamental monotony remained. The same could be said for the monks in their abbeys and monasteries. while they generally ate better than the laity, subsisting on bread, cheese, fish, and ale. Their diet was still quite Spartan by modern standards. Rich spices and exotic ingredients were reserved for the tables of the nobility. Speaking of ale, it was the common drink of the Middle Ages, consumed by young and old alike. Clean drinking water was often scarce, and the fermentation process provided some protection against waterborne illness. But even this small comfort could be adulterated by unscrupulous brewers, stretching their product with unsavory additives. Dishonest bakers might do the same with bread, mixing the precious wheat flour with cheaper grains, bran, or even sawdust. And chalk. Such deceits were officially frowned upon and could be harshly punished if discovered. But the desperate realities of the time made them all too common. This was a world where food was a daily struggle, a relentless cycle of toil and hunger for all but a privileged few. The nobles in their grand halls, dining on elaborately prepared dishes and fine wines, seemed to inhabit an entirely different plane of existence from the grimy, half-starved peasants working their lands. It was a stark divide, one that bred resentment and sometimes open rebellion. But more often, it bred a sort of grim resignation and acceptance that this was simply the way things were. A peasant's lot was to suffer and endure to eke out a meagre, living from an unforgiving land and hope for a better life in the hereafter. Yet even in the midst of such hardship, there were small moments of respite and celebration. Holidays and feast days provided brief glimpses of plenty, when even the poorest might enjoy a bit of meat or a sweet pastry. Weddings, christenings, and other milestones were marked with communal meals, a chance for neighbors to come together and share what little they had. These fleeting moments of conviviality made the hard times more bearable, a reminder that even in the face of great adversity, the human spirit could endure. And endure they did, these hard-bitten medieval folk. They bore their burdens with a stoicism and tenacity that's hard to fathom from our modern vantage point. They faced each day with grim determination, knowing that survival depended on their own hard work and cunning. In a world where starvation was always lurking just around the corner, there was no room for idleness or self-pity. Perhaps that's why tales of great feasts and fantastical foods held such appeal. In medieval popular culture. In a society where hunger was the norm, stories of tables groaning under the weight of succulent meats, fresh fruits, and sweet delicacies offered a tantalizing escape from reality. Myths and legends often featured magical cauldrons that never ran empty or enchanted lands, where no one ever went hungry. These fanciful tales spoke to a deep, unquenchable yearning for plenty in a world defined by scarcity. But while the medieval peasant might dream of such wonders, their daily reality remained one of unrelenting hardship. The spectre of famine was never far away, ready to descend at the first sign of blight or drought. And even in good times, the diet of the common folk was woefully inadequate by modern nutritional standards, heavy on grains and light on pretty much everything else. It left much of the population malnourished and susceptible to disease. This chronic malnutrition had far-reaching effects on medieval society. It stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and made childbirth even more perilous than it already was. It sapped strength and vitality, leaving peasants ill-equipped to handle the back-breaking labor. That was their lot in life, and it contributed to the general sense of misery and desperation that hung over so much of the medieval world, like a pall. Yet despite it all, life went on. Crops were planted and harvested, babies were born and raised, and the great wheel of existence kept turning. The medieval peasant might not have had much in the way of material comforts, but they had their faith, their family, and the community to sustain them. They found joy where they could in the simple pleasures of a warm fire on a cold night or a full belly after the harvest feast, and they endured season after brutal season with a resilience and fortitude that's hard not to admire. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to savor the incredible variety and abundance at your fingertips. Spare a thought for your medieval ancestors, who lived and died by the winds of the harvest, and be grateful for the centuries of progress and plenty that separate us from those grim hungry times. Because while the medieval peasant might have dreamed of a magical land of endless feasts, we're lucky enough to live in a world where the dream is tantalizingly close to reality. and that's a privilege we should never take for granted. The plight of the medieval peasant was further compounded by the unbalanced nature of their diets. While the nobility feasted on a cornucopia of meats, fruits, and vegetables, the average serf subsisted on a megafare dominated by grains. Porridge, gruel, and coarse bread formed the backbone of their sustenance, supplemented by whatever small morsels they could eke out from their labors. A typical peasant family might count themselves fortunate to have a cow, a pig, or a small flock of chickens. However, the milk, eggs, and meat these animals provided were a rare treat, reserved for special occasions or times of dire need. More often than not, any surplus was sold or paid as rent to their feudal lord, leaving little for the family's own consumption. Imagine, if you will, the stark contrast between a noble's lavish feast and a serf's humble meal. In the great hall of the castle, the tables groan under the weight of roasted meats, savory pies, exotic fruits, and fine cheeses. The air is filled with the aroma of saffron, cinnamon, and cloves as richly attired lords and ladies dine with gusto. Meanwhile, in the cramped cell of a peasant family, a pot of thin gruel bubbles over the fire. The mother carefully portions out the meager serving, ensuring each member of the family receives just enough to stave off the gnawing hunger in their bellies. The children's eyes widen at the sight of a small crust of bread, a precious addition to their usual fare. The unbalanced nature of the peasant diet took a heavy toll on their health. Malnutrition was rampant, weakening the immune system and leaving the population vulnerable to disease. Scurvy caused by lack of vitamin C was a common affliction, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death if untreated in times. A famine, known as seasons of dirt, the situation became even more dire. Crop failures due to drought,
flooding, or pests could spell disaster for entire regions, with no reserves to fall back on. Peasant families were left to starve, their weakened bodies succumbing to hunger and disease. One particularly harrowing tale comes from the chronicler Henry of Livonia, who described a famine in the early 10th century. He wrote of peasants driven to such desperation that they resorted to eating dogs, cats, and even the corpses of the dead. While such extreme measures were rare, they serve as a grim reminder of the precarious nature of life for the medieval peasantry. The unequal distribution of food in medieval society was a stark reflection of the rigid class hierarchy that defined the era. While the nobility enjoyed a varied and plentiful diet, the vast majority of the population lived on the brink of starvation. Their meals a monotonous and meager affair. This disparity would persist for centuries, with only gradual improvements in agricultural techniques and social reforms slowly narrowing the gap. As we continue our journey through the culinary landscape of the Middle Ages, we turn our attention to another scourge that plagued the populace: adulterated food and drink. In a time before strict regulations and quality control, unscrupulous merchants and producers often resorted to cutting corners and deceiving their customers in the name of profit. One common target for adulteration was bread, a staple of the medieval diet. Bakers seeking to stretch their meager supplies of flour would mix in a variety of unsavory additives. Ground acorns, chalk, sawdust, and even ground bones were among the fillers used to bulk up the loaves. The resulting bread was often dense, gritty, and lacking in both flavor and nutrition. Ale and wine, the favored drinks of the era, were also subject to tampering. In a time when clean drinking water was often scarce, these fermented beverages were seen as a safer alternative. However, unscrupulous brewers and vendors would often water down their products to increase their profits, resulting in weak, insipid drinks that did little to quench the thirst or lift the spirits. The story of Agnes Thielu wife illustrates the temptation to adulterate one's wares. Agnes, a widow struggling to make ends meet, relied on the meager profits from her small brewing operation to supper herself and her children. One particularly lean year, with the price of grains soaring and her customers dwindling, Agnes made the forethought decision to water down her ale. Stretching her limited supply to sell more volume, at first, her deception went unnoticed, and Agnes breathed a sigh of relief as the coins clinketed into her purse. However, word soon spread of the weak, tasteless brew, and her once loyal customers began to seek out other alehouses. Agnes's reputation was ruined, and she was forced to close her doors, leaving her family to face an uncertain future. While medieval authorities did attempt to regulate the quality of food and drink, enforcement was often lax and inconsistent. A sigh of bread and ale, a th-century English law, set strict standards for the weight and price of these staples. But bakers and brewers found creative ways to skirt the rules. Fines and public humiliation were common punishments for those caught adulterating their products. But failure of easy profits often outweighed the risk of getting caught. The prevalence of adulterated food and drink in medieval society added yet another layer of misery to the already challenging lives of the common people. Not only were their diets monotonous and nutritionally deficient, but they also had to contend with the constant threat of being cheated or sickened by unscrupulous producers. It was a harsh reminder of the powerlessness of the masses in the face of a system stacked against them. As we delve deeper into the realities of medieval food, it becomes increasingly clear that the romantic image of a bountiful rustic past is a far cry from the truth. For the vast majority of the population, eating was a daily struggle fraught with scarcity, monotony, and the ever-present spectre of adulteration. In a world where food was quite literally a matter of life and death, the medieval peasant had little choice but to make do with whatever meager sustenance they could scrape together. But the challenges of medieval dining were not limited to the quality and quantity of the food itself. The very environment in which people ate was often a source of discomfort and even danger. In our next chapter, we will explore the unsanitary conditions that plagued the medieval world and how they contribute to the overall misery of the era's culinary landscape. Picture, if you will, a typical peasant dwelling in the Middle Ages. The small, cramped space is shared not only by the human occupants, but also by a menagerie of livestock. Chickens peck at the dirt floor while a pig roots in the corner, seeking out any stray scraps of food. The air is thick with the pungent aroma of unwashed bodies, animal dung, and wood smoke. In such close quarters, the line between living space and barnyard was often blurred. Livestock were kept indoors, not only for their own safety, but also for the warmth they provided during the cold winter months. However, this practice came at a steep price in terms of sanitation and hygiene. Animal waste combined with the general lack of cleanliness created a breeding ground for disease. Flies buzzed incessantly, spreading filth and contamination from one surface to another. The very food that the peasants relied on for survival was often tainted by the unsanitary conditions in which it was prepared and consumed. The consequences of this lack of hygiene were dire. Digestive ailments, parasitic infections, and food poisoning were common occurrences, sapping the strength and vitality of the population. Even the highest echelons of society were not immune to the dangers of contaminated food. As the story of King John of England illustrates, in the year King John was on the move, campaigning against rebel baronses who sought to limit his power. During a stay at the town of Lynn, he indulged in a feast of peaches, a rare treat for the time. However, unbeknownst to the king, the peaches had been improperly stored and had begun to rot. Consumed by hunger and a love of exotic fruits, John ate his full, only to fall violently ill shortly thereafter. Racked by dysentery and fever, the king's health rapidly deteriorated. He pressed on with his campaign, but his weakened state left him vulnerable to the elements. Crossing the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash, John's baggage train was lost to the rising waters, taking with it his crown jewels and other treasures. The king himself narrowly escaped with his life, but his days were numbered. Less than 2 weeks later, he succumbed to his illness, his reign cut short by a simple meal of tainted fruit. King John's fate, while perhaps more dramatic than most, was not uncommon in a world where food safety was a rare luxury. The medieval landscape was a veritable minefield of potential hazards, from spoiled meat to contaminated water sources. Even the air itself could be a source of danger, as the miasma theory of disease held sway. According to this belief, for foul odor and bad air were the primary culprits behind the spread of illness. Medieval cities, with their narrow winding streets and piles of festering garbage, were seen as particularly noxious environments. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and industrial pollution mingled together in a miasmatic brew that was believed to be the source of all manner of ailments. In reality, of course, it was the unsanitary conditions themselves that allowed disease to thrive. The Black Death, which wiped out an estimated of Europe's population in the th century, was spread not by bedar, but by fleas infected with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The crowded, filthy conditions of medieval cities provided an ideal environment for the disease to take hold and spread like wildfire. The impact of unsanitary conditions on medieval food culture cannot be overstated. It was not merely a matter of unpleasant odor and occasional bouts of illness, but a pervasive and deadly threat that loomed over every meal. The simple act of eating, which we today take for granted as a pleasurable and nourishing experience, was fraught with danger and uncertainty for the average medieval peasant. In a world where even the most basic standards of hygiene were often lacking, food became not just a source of sustenance, but also a potential vector for disease and suffering. This, combined with the scarcity and monotony of the peasant diet, created a culinary landscape that was as bleak as it was unappetizing. As we continue our exploration of why food in medieval times sucked, it is important to remember that the challenges we have discussed so far, the lack of variety, the difficulty of preservation, the unbalanced diets, and the unsanitary conditions, were not the only factors at play. In our next chapter, we will turn our attention to the role of the church in shaping the culinary habits of the time, and how religious doctrine often compounded the already considerable hardships faced by the average medieval